This is very definitely a Christmas video about a Christmas video game. But imagine that it was actually planned for Halloween. If you were in the market for a spooky game back then, you'd be forgiven for thinking you'd travelled back in time. The warped, murky 3D of the PS1 era has made an unlikely comeback, driven by creators such as Puppet Combo and Kitty Horror Show, and the combined works of the haunted PS1 collective. What these developers have cottoned onto isn't just 90s nostalgia, but a unique moment in video game history. The limitations of consoles at the time were such that rendering everything in 3D was a struggle. If you wanted a building to look like a building and a character to look like, well, this, you had to make sacrifices somewhere else. What this led to was an enormous number of creative solutions. Studios such as Square and Capcom used 2D painted backgrounds that only appeared to be 3D, reducing the strain on the hardware. Sound design was used to suggest more enemies than could be displayed at the same time. And you may know one game that shrouded its landscapes in an eerie pall of fog, masking the fact that, until you're about 5 feet in front of them, the buildings weren't actually there. For genre fans, this was a moment of incredible serendipity. Video games were at the height of their cultural relevance and were as popular as they'd ever been. Yet at the same time, the limited scope of games meant that they could still be made by teams in the dozens rather than in the hundreds. Add to that the fact that no one really knew what they were doing with 3D games yet, and you have an industry that wasn't just incentivized to take risks, but forced to. This maelstrom of creative freedom and technical experimentation was the start of the golden age of survival horror. Talk about survival horror now and you'll probably think of the titans of the genre, your Resident Evils and Silent Hills. But the period from around 96 to 2004 wasn't just the crucible in which the greatest survival horror games were fired. The incredible thing about this era, and one of the reasons it's so rewarding to go back to, is how many ways that genre was interpreted. See, while Resident Evil and its remake set the template for survival horror, almost every game in this period brought something new to the table. Resident Evil 2 was more action-oriented, doing away with the careful resource management of the first game, while Resident Evil 3 brought lavish open environments and the Terminator-esque nemesis. Silent Hill veered off into psychological and industrial horror, while games like Clock Tower and D, yep, have fun googling that one, used FMVs and adventure game mechanics to tell slower and more cinematic stories. Now, if there's a developer that's synonymous with the PS1 era, it's Square. Best known for the Final Fantasy series, Square developed and published no less than 39 games for the original PlayStation, ranging from strategy to sword fighting to shoot 'em ups. Nestled in amongst these was, you guessed it, a survival horror franchise, and its name was Parasite Eve. Parasite Eve follows a New York police officer by the somewhat unfortunate name of Aya Breyer. Aya is on a date at the opera, the reasons for which seem even to elude her. During the performance, Aya falls under the gaze of the soprano and things get a little bit heated. The only thing I knew about Parasite Eve going in was how it starts, and I found it completely fascinating. I don't know if you can consider something that happens 2 minutes in as a spoiler. If you've played the game Mass Effect 2, this goes similarly hard out of the gate. If you were already planning on playing it and don't know what happens, skip out about 30 seconds and I'll try and contain my excitement. So, as the pair's eyes meet, a knowing smile flashes across the face of the actress. As the song hits its crescendo, the audience at Carnegie Hall begins to spontaneously combust, staggering towards the exits and toppling from the gallery above. Mysteriously unaffected, Aya confronts the singer, who dubs herself Eve, and chases her into the bowels of the theatre. What follows is a genuinely novel sci-fi story. Adapted from a book by Japanese scientist Sena Hideaki, the story riffs on a theory that the mitochondria in our cells were once separate organisms. It soon becomes clear that Eve is able to manipulate the mitochondria of living beings around her and take control of them on a cellular level. What this leads to, both in story and gameplay terms, is a menagerie of grotesque monsters and gruesome deaths. I'm a big fan of both body horror and disaster movies, and Parasite Eve ticks both boxes with relish. While some of the deaths happen in-engine, the cutscenes do a lot of the heavy lifting here. CG transformation sequences showed tentacles erupting from animals, jaws stretching and pus dripping and pooling. Cinematic games usually fall down because they over-rely on cutscenes. The worst kind of games are the ones that flip to cutscenes whenever they need some exposition, essentially wheeling out the characters to explain the story before you get back to the action. I'm reminded of a quote by the film critic Mark Kermode, who once explained Michael Bay's use of actors as getting some people in to do the acting so he can get on with the rest of the movie. This approach is not only lazy, but in the context of a game, that kind of partitioning between story and gameplay can completely draw you out of the world. There's a reason these cutscenes are probably my favourite part of Parasite Eve, and it's about more than how cool they are. That's a big part of it too, mind you. They get away with doing things to people and animals that would seem almost obscene in modern graphics, though they're more unsettling than they are gory. Above that though, it's just how sparingly they're used. Contrary to the usual approach, the cutscenes in Parasite Eve exist to bring things to life that can't be done in-engine. These jerky, rubbery, squelching interludes add colour to the boss fights and give weight to the dialogue, despite being fairly truncated. While Aya isn't the star of the cutscenes, she is nevertheless a compelling character. Horror games of the era were notable for their playable female characters, something they likely borrowed from horror cinema. Now, the interplay of vulnerability and sexuality in horror movies is way too big for me to get into here, but it is to Parasite Eve's credit that Aya isn't your typical slasher-style protagonist. While she's clearly drawn to be attractive insofar as a PS1 character could be, she isn't overtly sexualised and is shown to be as composed and capable as her police counterparts. Her response at the opera after diving out of the way of a falling corpse is to draw her gun and shove her date back towards the exit. That is about as gung-ho as she gets, admittedly, and the game plays on the contrast between her by-the-book policing and her slightly renegade partner Daniel. I was less keen on his characterisation. He's basically the same stereotype as Barrett from FF7, but the fact that he is a less capable partner to Aya does at least make for an interesting dynamic. The actual game that sits between these set pieces is a curious hybrid of strategy, action and RPG elements. The game is presented from a top-down, third-person perspective, with the camera sweeping across a series of painted backgrounds. As the story progresses, new locations are added to a basic 3D map of New York, which you can access between missions. While each level is fairly linear, there are winding paths and dead ends throughout, and it wouldn't be a Square game from this era without an infuriating maze level. Parasite Eve came out just after Resident Evil 2, but more importantly, it came out a few months before Final Fantasy VII. You're going to be hearing those two names a lot, so apologies in advance, but they do share a bunch of similarities. Like both of those games, Parasite Eve places 3D characters on top of hand-drawn 2D backgrounds. Rather than using random encounters or fixed enemies, however, encounters take place in specific parts of the map. Run through these hotspots and the screen flashes with enemies spawning around you. I played the game on the PS1, although it is still available to download on PS3 and Vita. I'd always recommend playing pre-rendered games on a CRT if you can, but otherwise the Vita is probably the way to go. Because a lot of the original artwork from this era was lost, the modern versions still use the low-res renders from the PS1 version, which look a hell of a lot better on a smaller screen. There are some very clever and dedicated people who have remastered games similar to this, like the brilliant Seamless HD project for Resident Evil 2 and 3. But even if you redraw the textures, it's hard to emulate the unique look and feel of a CRT. Plus, making things super sharp and beautiful can make them less scary. I'm really going to annoy some people here, but I was a bit underwhelmed by Parasite Eve's visuals. Sure, nobody's playing these games for the graphics anymore, but the best pre-rendered games can still look good on original hardware. FF7's colours pop more than this crappy mic setup, and Resident Evil is still lush and atmospheric. By contrast, Parasite Eve has a more muted colour palette, and the backgrounds are a bit more impressionistic than they are hyper-real. While this works well in some areas, a lot of the game just feels like you're skating across a series of oil paintings. This might be okay if there was more going on in each frame, but the game also suffers from a lack of dynamic details. FF7 and Resi are constantly overlaying moving objects on top of the static image, whether that's sliding statues, flickering lights, or whirring and grinding cogs. They're simple flourishes, but they're numerous and eye-catching enough to make the static backgrounds feel like part of a living, breathing world. The screens where Parasite Eve does do this, like the cop car interludes or Clamp's office, aren't the best looking parts of the game. I just don't think it uses this trick quite often enough. One area that Parasite Eve can't cop any criticism is the soundtrack. Composed by Shimomura Yoko of Kingdom Hearts fame, the contrast with most of her other work is pretty staggering. While there is an operatic refrain throughout the game that will feel familiar, most of the background audio consists of haunting synths, lilting piano lines, and pulsing electronic beats. In places it's very Resident Evil, but overall it's both more atmospheric and more melodramatic than that franchise. There's just so much variety and such consistent quality here, from the Donkey Kong Country-esque out of phase to the eerie and pulse racing Under the Progress. It's faultless from start to finish, and if you take nothing else from this, I recommend checking it out. I've mostly talked about the aesthetics of the game so far, so let's jump into how it actually plays. Well, similarly to FF7, Parasite Eve uses an active time battle system, where you wait for a bar to fill up and then choose an attack. As well as your basic attack, you also gain access to an increasing arsenal of magic powers, known as Parasite Energy. These can be used to heal, deal damage, or inflict status effects such as increasing your movement speed or confusing an enemy. That's pretty much where the comparisons end. True to the genre, in Parasite Eve you only ever fight by yourself. Where combat in FF7 is a flurry of menuing as you queue up attacks for your various party characters, Parasite Eve occupies you in a different way. Similar to the PS3 game Ni no Kuni, or indeed the recent FF7 remake, you can move around the battle arena during the fight, dodging enemies and carefully timing your attacks. The combat in Parasite Eve can be frustrating, and that's not just because the arenas are a bit small or the hitboxes are a bit sketchy. Where the combat in FF7 offers you a degree of flexibility in how you approach killing things, Parasite Eve is simplistic by comparison. There are only two offensive powers, and one of them is the last ability you get in the game. For the most part, combat in Parasite Eve consists of running around a bit, shooting your gun, and then waiting for your gauge to fill back up. Parasite Eve uses a separate mana bar for your magic abilities, and like FF7, using an ability uses up both your mana and your turn. In Final Fantasy this makes sense because with multiple characters their turns frequently overlap. If you cast a status effect, your other characters can attack while that character recharges. In Parasite Eve, your ability to do this is dependent on funneling the points you get from completing levels into improving your recharge speed, something we'll touch on again later. Until a fair way into the game, I found that by the time my gauge had recharged from, say, slowing an enemy down, the status effect had almost worn off, making it a complete waste of time. Even when your abilities become slightly more viable, most of them are either unnecessary, underpowered, or superseded by later ones. I could deal with this if the game lent into the magic, but the spells in Parasite Eve also lack the melodrama of FF7's grandiose casting animations. It's clearly an attempt to maintain some flow to the combat, but the combat is already so slow and tedious that it becomes a moot point. When I can't even have fun as a magician in modern New York, something's gone pretty drastically wrong. Compared to how fucking balmy the story is, this lack of variety can turn the intervening combat sections into a bit of a grind. There are certain parts of the game where there are so many enemies in a small space that it becomes impossible to avoid getting hit, subjecting you to damage and status effects. Each area normally has item drops that cure the status effects common to that area, but there will still be times you essentially get stun locked by enemies that remove your ability to shoot them. To Parasite Eve's credit, it is possible to power through the story without grinding, though it does make it significantly less fun. I know this because it's how I played pretty much the first half of the game, and for a while I really wasn't vibing with it. There was only one area where the game got genuinely difficult, but for the most part, battles were just taking a long time to finish. What I came to learn is that while some of this is inherent to the gameplay, a lot of it is down to how you utilise the game's XP and customisation mechanics. The most obvious form of progression in Parasite Eve is XP, which you get from completing battles. This raises your character's level, which helps you to unlock new powers and boosts your stats. Second, and somewhat buried in the game's menus, you get bonus points for completing levels and not being hit in combat. These can be spent in two places. This menu here, which gives you more inventory space or increases your action point refill speed, and a couple of distinct vendors where you can funnel them into weapon stat increases. Third, you can use tools found throughout the game to transfer effects or stat improvements between your weapons and armour, and fourth, you can get extra effect slots added to your guns. While the manual and help menu do flesh out these systems, the game itself barely mentions them, leaving you to dive in and experiment on your own. Failing to teach you core mechanics is a very 90s game thing, so I can't ride Parasite Eve for it too hard, but it is frustrating given how central they are to the gameplay. Having the wrong gun with the wrong status effects for an enemy isn't just a case of being less optimal, you might literally be doing 1 damage per shot. And again, if you haven't farmed bonus points to put them into your recharge speed, your PE powers are totally neutered. Here's an example. If you transfer a rate of fire effect, which dictates how many bullets you fire per action, it overwrites the rate of fire on the weapon you move it to. If you transfer an ammo type, however, say a fire type onto a weapon that already had an ice type, the weapon keeps both effects. That's fine, but it's an inconsistency the game doesn't tell you about, and you might have to sacrifice a weapon to find it out. With most tools you find, you lose the weapon or armour you're removing the effect from when you transfer it. Practically speaking, this means you either try something and potentially ruin your loadout, or run to a save point so you can reload and run back. Those effects are important because, as you might have inferred, not every enemy takes the same damage. In classic RPG fashion, all enemies are strong or weak against different damage types. In Final Fantasy, this only affects your spells and summons. If you use a spell and it does no damage, you usually have a bunch of others to try, or you can just do a standard attack. In Parasite Eve, you might only have one weapon, and if that weapon isn't effective against an enemy, well, good luck doing any damage. That's a basic example, but there's a lot of stuff the game just doesn't tell you. For instance, the longer you're in a battle for, the slower your attack bar recharges, making encounters even more glacial. Nowhere in the game does it tell you that this effect accumulates on armour. If you change your armour and then change back, the recharge rate returns to normal. There are also a bunch of abilities and weapons that just plain suck, and in an RPG that kind of experimentation is fine. But this isn't an RPG, this is a 7-hour game. You barely have time to learn enough to get a good loadout before it's over. What this is all building towards is the game's New Game Plus mode. Now, full disclosure, I don't really get New Game Plus, it's not for me. Unless I really fall in love with a single player game, I will only play it once, and I can count those exceptions on 2 hands. I get in there, I experience it, I enjoy the story, and I move on. The New Game Plus mode in Parasite Eve allows you to play the exact same campaign with whatever gun and armour you nominate at the end of your first playthrough. You also get to keep all the non-plot items you kept in storage, so things like your weapons, armour and healing items. Anything else you had in your inventory gets discarded, and your inventory space upgrades get reset. While enemy HP and item drops also change slightly, the main addition to this X game is the Chrysler building, which I'd heard was a sort of Pokemon style battle tower. I gave the New Game Plus mode a real shot because I heard it was the only way to get the true ending. I played up to the 5th chapter and I'll admit, it does make the game more fun. Enemies are tougher, but having your endgame armour and weapon allows you to blast through a lot of random encounters while still enjoying the boss battles and the story. Because you get to pick up all the same guns again, and get a lot more tools the second time around, you also get to experiment a lot more freely with weapon modifications and use your experience with the game to build a better loadout. My elation was cut slightly short when I decided to finally check out the Chrysler building. I knew it was where the true ending happened and I assumed that it would be best tackled right at the end of the campaign. But hey, I thought, why not check it out a bit early, blast through a few floors, see how much grinding I still needed to do, whether my weapons were up to scratch. What I found wasn't a series of linear, increasingly difficult battles, but the first of 77 randomly generated maze levels full of identical, snaking corridors. So I quit the game and watched the ending on YouTube. There are movies that critics will tell you need to be seen 2 or 3 times to be fully appreciated, and I am open to that concept. But fundamentally, that just isn't how I enjoy consuming media. I treasure the experience that I have of encountering something for the first time and the way I reacted to it in that moment. I think there's a sort of emotional clarity to your first experience of something that often cuts right to the heart of it. You can appreciate and understand things more over time, it's true, but you'll never exceed the highs of a great first impression or reverse the lows of a bad one. I don't want to make a hard qualitative judgment about Parasite Eve because I know there's a scenario where you come back to this game, boot up an old save and have an absolute blast playing through the X game. I see a lot of horror streamers who love it and I can understand why. The story and the combat are unique, there's a huge amount of customization and it doesn't overstay its welcome. Play it fresh in 2021 though, and I just don't think those different elements quite coalesce. The body horror cutscenes are skin-crawlingly creepy, but the horror elsewhere is muted. The boss battles with their multiple stages and variety of attacks are genuinely good fun, but the encounters in between are tedious. The use of real locations is interesting, but the sense of a living world is absent. Despite all of this, I have come away from Parasite Eve with a genuine sense of admiration. I play a lot of horror games and I don't think there's ever been another game quite like it, either in terms of content or pacing. It's a unique experience and I'd recommend it to genre fans without too much hesitation. For all its charm and weirdness though, Parasite Eve still feels like an evolutionary dead end, the realisation of a concept that just never quite took off. And ultimately, I guess there's something fitting about that. Though aspects of the game would crop up later, the central conceit of a cinematic, cutscene driven horror RPG, well, that pretty much died with its host. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, give it a like. If you didn't, hey, give it a dislike. It's all engagement. Go nuts. Click subscribe for more videos like this and I'll try and reduce the intervals between these by a bit less than a year. Take care.